In the early 2000s, Pocatello, Idaho seemed to feel like a safe, sleepy town where nothing bad happened. That all changed in late September 2006. 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was found stabbed to death while house sitting for her relatives in the Whispering Cliffs neighborhood. Law enforcement eventually zeroed in on two of her classmates, Draper and Torey Adamcik, and the investigation ultimately led them to discover a hidden, chilling videotape. On it, the two teens captured the moments leading up to Cassie's murder, their reactions right after, and their plans for more violence. Draper and Adamcik were ultimately convicted of Stoddart's murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Scream Murder, a true teen horror story, revisits the unthinkable crime, and the co-executive producers of the docuseries, Conor McCarthy and Patrick Rogers, joined Forbes True Crime to discuss. Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, the host of Forbes True Crime. Joining me now are Conor McCarthy and Patrick Rogers, the co-executive producers of the new docuseries, The Scream Murder. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Your new docuseries tells the story of the murder of 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart, and she was brutally stabbed while she was house sitting in her town of Pocatello, Idaho. And she was killed by two of her classmates. They came in, they viciously stabbed her. And I think the most chilling part, really, of this entire story was a few days into the police's investigation, they find this videotape. And on the videotape, the two boys are talking about the murder. They're talking about their plans beforehand. They're documenting that. And then they're documenting the moments after Cassie was brutally murdered. So, to start off the conversation, what drew you both to this story?
Well, I mean, you have to, I think you begin with what you were just saying, and that is that tape. There, unfortunately, are a lot of murders in this country, and it's not completely unheard of for a high school kid to murder another high school kid. But what makes this baffling and strange and noteworthy, I guess, is that tape. There's never, at least in my 25 years or so of true crime, never seen anything like this. So you have to start with that tape, but that's only the start. The case itself and the people involved are really, so if the tape is the thing that makes it stand out, the people involved, the parents, the killers themselves, this is what really makes you take a deeper dive than just that tape. But I think to answer your question, it's the tape first and foremost that really shocks anybody, even the most hardened detectives who've seen it.
I mean, it was shocking, just blood curdling. But Connor, what about you? Was the tape the thing that drew you in?
Well, absolutely. That's the first thing that pulled us in because it was quite unusual for A, to it exist, and B, to have been done by the two teenage kids, and what compelled them to do that. But also for me going in, there were a lot of questions and things, and being a parent and curious that there were three families that were involved. Obviously, the victim, Cassie Jo Stoddart, which is unimaginable to lose a child to violence, extreme violence, avoidable, wholly avoidable. But there are two other families, the Drapers and the Adamciks. And what happened to them? And, I've said this in the past, and I think this was something that I was pondering, as a parent myself. Your greatest fear is something happens to your child. For a lot of people, your second greatest fear is your child does something to someone else. And what happens when your child does something to someone else to that extreme? And so that's, we wanted to actually kind of look at it from that perspective. One of the perspectives would be from the killer's parents and their whole experience, from that initial knock on the door, on the other side of it, to homicide detectives wanting to speak to your 16-year-old boy.
To that point, the series dives right in, talking with Brian Draper's parents as well as Tori Adamczyk's mother, and they are the two murderers here. And I think that when you're thinking about a tragedy, especially committed against a young person, when you're thinking about the family of the victim, the only feelings you feel are nothing but compassion and sympathy and empathy. But I think when you're thinking about the family or perhaps the parents of a person who committed a crime against a young person, those feelings are a lot more complicated. Those feelings are a lot more conflicting, I could imagine, because even as a viewer here, I was watching this show and I felt a lot of complicated feelings towards the parents. And you two were having these conversations with Brian's parents, with Tori's mom. You're witnessing these conversations. I'm curious if you found truth in that your feelings were very complicated towards the parents of Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik. What did that look like for you?
Well, I can answer that because I interviewed both Shannon and Pam and Draper as Pat did many years ago. And I think I did enter this with a point of view, obviously, because of what they had done. But I also promised to, I think the Drapers and Adamciks asked, like, just be fair to us and let us speak openly. And I wanted to take as neutral a position as possible, but always never forgetting Cassie. We always lean heavily on Cassie, obviously, because this is someone whose voice was taken, whose life was taken. We can never forget about that. And that can never be undone. But also give the Adamciks, a neutral sort of voice guide to allow them to speak on their son's behalf and also to speak openly and honestly, like they've never have in the past. Now that it's 20 years, and I think 20 years there is a milestone in terms of people being able to talk about a lot of things, particularly that changed their lives forever.
Yeah, they were so open. I mean, open really is an understatement. But Patrick, what about you? Did you have any conflicting feelings while listening to this? What were those complicated feelings like? Because as time went on, when you heard the interviews with Brian and Tori and law enforcement, when you heard and talked with law enforcement officials, when you saw their interviews in the investigation, and then after, when you heard all of these other perspectives, what did those feelings change like for you? What does that look like for you now?
Well, conflicted and complicated. That is the right way to characterize it. You do, as Connor said, I did interview these parents years ago, closer to when this happened in 2009, I think it was. I did an earlier project, and you see an evolution actually in Shannon Adamcik, particularly, where when I first interviewed her, she said, "No, there's no way. My son had nothing. It's all Brian." And she is, as you see in the Hulu documentary, has softened that and changed that. But when you watch not only the parents, but also if you watch that Brian Draper interview where he confesses and he tells police what happened, where they can find the evidence, including the tape, and you watch and you see him crying and sort of breaking down. And half of you says, "Oh, well, here he is. He's in a moment of crisis. These are real emotions, and he's really breaking down." But then they go and get the videotape, and they press play, and they see him plotting and scheming and laughing about what they're about to do, and then being gleeful after the murder. So talk about conflict. You see this kid in this state in the interrogation room with the police where he's confessing and he's crying and his parents are there, and then you see this sinister tape where he's plotting this murder with his best friend. So that's the conflict right there. Is like, what kind of mind can do this? It's completely diabolical, that tape. And then you see him in some of the videotapes doing a 16-year-old kid doing his skateboard tricks. He's playing soccer. So conflict, you use the word, it's the right word. Obviously they murdered a 16-year-old girl. So the conflict is sort of resolved. They did it. They're guilty. They are where they should be. But it is weird to see them as kids almost, and then as demented killers on that tape.
I mean, it was really startling to see, like you said, Brian crying. You see Tori's interview with police, then you see that tape. And I mean, gleeful is really the only way to describe them documenting before and after killing Cassie. And then they had another victim list. They were plotting a mass shooting. I think they said that that would be a great end to this whole story. And I mean, I believe Brian's parents, they were like, they could not wrap their heads around that their son was the one who was featured on this tape. They couldn't put it together that those two people really were the same. And I know that Brian's mom, especially when she was talking, she said things to the effect of, my son eventually did the right thing. He went to law enforcement. He told them what happened. He is a good kid. And I think both parents, to some extent, maybe Brian's mom a little more than Brian's dad or Tori's mom, thought that the other kid was the mastermind, that without Brian or without Tori, their son was kind of dragged into this and none of it would happen without the other one. But when you were sitting there listening to these conversations, what were you thinking? What is your perspective here, especially in your roles as executive producer? I mean, where do you go from there?
I mean,
Oh,
that's the big question, and obviously it's was one side more influential than the other, and I don't think we can ever answer that question. I think Brian, I spoke to Brian and Tori for months last summer, interviewing them, and they were open books about it as well. Um, I think maybe they do remember things slightly differently in terms of who was the more the aggressor. I think they would have an argument to say that the other one was the one that led it, and but I don't believe they both were caught in lies, multiple lies. So we have to take that into account. But the Drapers have the horror film side, and the Adamciks. They felt like that Brian was actually the darker force between the two of them. But as I think Carrie is the one that puts it all together. It's not Brian. It's not about Tori. It's Brian and Tori, and these two kids coming together at that point where, as Tori says, we were both in this crisis and we had reasons to hate, but for different reasons. They just it's this perfect storm that turned into a plot to kill within a few weeks after they had kind of become friends. It was fast and furious, their friendship, that from the moment they started hanging out to the night they took Cassie's life was only a matter of a couple of months.
Yeah, that was a really shocking tidbit. I think someone in the series said that the friendship between Tori and Brian only lasted about 4 months until Cassie's murder. But Patrick, do you have anything to add there? Sitting down, hearing other people's perspectives, especially as an executive producer. I mean, what are you thinking? Especially, I'm sure because everyone's human, I'm sure they have their own theory on what happened.
Well, you see Brian in the interview room where he's confessing. But if you remember why he was there, he had said he was going to come in and take a lie detector test. There is a school of thought that says Brian believed and knew he couldn't pass a lie detector test. So the next best thing is blame the other guy. So it sort of goes to the whole idea of who is more guilty, who was leading whom, and it's almost impossible to say. Personally, it's been a debate back and forth. I have my own feeling, and it's not supported by science. Just having done this story a couple of times and been around it for months and months and months this time, and I have a feeling that Tori, actually, if we're going to talk about a debate on this side, I think Tori was actually the controller, and Brian was very suggestible. Not to excuse anything either of them did at all for 1 second, but in my heart, in my mind, I think Tori was directing this. Tori wanted to be a director. He made home horror movies when he was younger. He was the one writing about the props and such. So that is my opinion. I kind of think, I always say it this way. If Brian had never met Tori, I think Brian might have been okay. But I think Tori had something in him. And again, it's just my opinion, but I think he had something in him and something was going to happen with this kid somewhere down the line.
And that was one of the big questions in this series. And one of the other questions came up after sentencing because, regardless of who the mastermind here was, both boys got the same sentence, a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And that brought up one of the big questions, a moral criminal justice question, because it's been now almost 20 years since Cassie was murdered. The big question being if juveniles who commit murder should be given life without parole. And I know that you posed a question in the series to Brian's dad if it was now time for his son to come home if he served enough time. And he went on to say it was a very difficult question for him, but he did say that he would love his son to get a second chance to prove that he's worthy again. But he did say that Cassie is never getting that second chance, and he's really conflicted by this. And I know Tori's mom, it really seemed like she's come to terms with the fact that her son will probably never step foot out of jail again. And she did say, though, at the time of the sentencing, a life sentence without parole was really incomprehensible. But you had this really interesting conversation with the mother of Sean Willett, and he was murdered in the 80s when he was 14 years old by a classmate. And his killer ultimately, in 2024, was granted parole. She does not think that that was a good idea. In fact, she was vehemently against that. So what do you make of that question? Should juveniles who commit murder, should they be given life without parole?
I think everyone, including, well, the Supreme Court ruled on this. The majority ruled that science is a factor in this decision. So we cannot put juveniles to death. That has been abolished. So with that, there is a distinction, in the eyes of the court, that the developing brain is a variable. But they did leave it open to the states because in the most extreme situations that life without parole would be appropriate. 27 states, at least, and including the District of Columbia, have outright abolished it. In Idaho, it remains intact. Someone, as long as the age is factored in, a judge could still sentence a juvenile to life without parole. So it's a tough one. And it's, I think for Carrie and the parents, they just wanted to put that, and that was a big reason why they wanted to be a part of this documentary, was to bring up this issue. And at the very least, have a review in front of a parole board in 40 years. Who are Brian and Torey going to be at age 60 versus who they were at age 16? And I think for Brian, I think he articulated, whether you believe it or agree with it or not, I feel the 16-year-old committed the crime and I'm serving his punishment. And then we show in the video is almost like the former Brian was mocking the future Brian by shrugging his shoulders, like this is going to happen, and not understanding the consequences. And that's the big thing, the permanence of their actions. You can't unring that bell. It can't be undone. So where does it lie for them to have a second chance? And I think Carrie, the one, articulates the most. And he has a daughter. He has a second, and he says, if someone took her from me, how would I react? And that is what is so conflicting for them. And then with Sean Willett, that was having the mom, Jean, be a part of it. Anna Stoddart, Cassie's mother, had passed away, but we felt it was important for someone who could be close to Anna and have that same experience, where to lose a child, at the hands of another child for essentially a thrill kill. And Rod Matthews is getting out. So is it in the hands of the victim's family? Is it in the hands of the perpetrator's family? Like, where does it lie? Who should make that decision? So we thought it was important to bring that all up.
And you had a doctor on there saying, your brain's not fully developed yet. You don't understand consequence at certain ages. And I think that was clear when Brian was speaking with law enforcement. He was giving them information that led to the finding of that tape. And afterwards, he said something to the effect of, can we go back to school, or something like that, to his parents. And it was very clear once that happened, your life is over. There's no more school for you. So Patrick, what do you think? What do you make of this whole argument here?
Well, I think it doesn't apply equally, in my mind, to both Torey and Brian, in the sense that, and this is really what the law enforcement in Idaho, this is their opinion, and I don't disagree 100%. What they say is Brian, at least, whether he was really remorseful or whatever his real motivation was, he did confess. And he did basically solve the case for the police. Think about what would happen if he hadn't done that. If he hadn't said, we did it, here's how we did it, here's the evidence. If they had just stuck to their story, however ridiculous, who knows what would have happened. So the police that investigated said, someday, not today, not tomorrow, 40 years from now, maybe Brian, because of that cooperation, deserves to at least appear before a parole board. And what they do is up to them. Life without parole for a juvenile is a tough, it's a tough question. And like Conor said, 27 states don't allow it. Does it fall under the cruel and unusual Eighth Amendment? Yes, it does, according to the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court outlawed was mandatory life without parole. You can still get it if as a juvenile, but it's not mandatory. In some states, you get first degree murder. Life without parole is your mandatory sentence. Doesn't apply in 27 states for juveniles. So I I don't know. I don't know if, Judge McDermott, the sentencing judge, the trial judge, said, "Why would I let you out? You made a list of other people you want to kill. If I let you out, I don't know, you may go kill them. You did it. You already have done it. You said, we're going to kill Cassie. You killed Cassie. Here's a list of other people you wanted to kill. I can't take that chance." Is that far-fetched? I don't know. If you're Judge McDermott, do you want to find out? So that's a long way of saying I do think it's fair, actually. Cassie, there's no visiting hours for Cassie. The Adamciks and the Drapers can go to prison and visit their sons, as awful as that is. But you got to go to a graveyard to visit Cassie. So that's one thing I like to keep in mind.
And to your earlier point about Brian, he did lead investigators right to all of that evidence. And you had that shot of Black Rock Canyon where the evidence was. And the whole time I was just thinking, wow, I mean, would that evidence have ever been found? That's where the videotape was. Would the masks have ever been found? Would the knives have ever been found without him leading investigators right to them? That was a question I had in my head as well. But 20 years later, you're now speaking with both of them inside of jail. They happen to be in the same jail. I mean, what were those conversations like, listening to them, having them? And could you swear that the person you were speaking to just then was the same person who was on that tape almost 20 years ago?
It was hard. And it was over, I think I first spoke to both of them sometime around May. And then actually we started conducting interviews in August and September and October. And I still remember the first time that Brian showed up on my monitor. We were video conferencing, and that was the only way. We weren't allowed to bring cameras into the Idaho prison. And, you find ways to connect. I mean, here it is, a 35-year-old man. I was wearing a Vans t-shirt, skateboarding. We both had this kind of commonality. So try to find kind of common grounds. And they too said, look, I just give me an opportunity to speak on my behalf. And I wanted to do that. I didn't want them to shut down. But I always made sure that we okay, we're going to talk about Cassie, we're going to talk about that night. And they were pretty open about all of it. And I have a different relationship with a lot of these participants because of interviewing their parents and then speaking to them directly. It was tough. It was very conflicting because right above me, my 12-year-old daughter was running around. And so the kids in my mind is right there. But then I'm speaking to, they're articulate, smart, polite. They were nice guys. And so that was what it was really conflicting with. I'm having these conversations and then we will go to really dark places. And it was difficult to do that. And then just to hear about what their day-to-day life was. And it's not a good life where they are right now. And a lot of people said, they'll say good, but they just, it was interviews I'll never forget, to say the least.
And I could feel that while watching it. But Patrick, what about you? When you were watching them, when you were putting together this series, I mean, what were you feeling?
Kind of the same thing that Conor was. I met Torey when he was it was a couple years after the murder. He was probably 18. He was still looked exactly the way he did when he was arrested, kind of like a little teenage kid, no meat on the bones. And, you see them now as opposed to them then. They're, as Conor said, they're articulate, they're reasonable. But, they have an agenda. They're pariahs. They're probably pariahs even in prison. They killed a young girl. So they want to engender some kind of sympathy. Obviously, why else would they do this? They're not getting out. So I was of two minds, really, because it's striking, Brian especially, he's a reasonable cat, he's articulate and they're both seem to be thoughtful about this. but can't separate what they did, even though they were just teenagers. I just keep coming back to that. And you hear all the talk, and it does sort of work. You do sort of feel a sympathy for them. But then underneath that is, you guys murdered an innocent girl, and you were happy about it, and you planned it, and you wanted to kill others. So it is really, you used the word earlier, conflict. There is a conflict there. So you got to remember who you're talking to and what they did.
And as a viewer, I know that whenever I felt that conflict, I feel like the series at the most perfect time really reminded you exactly why you were watching this story in the first place. And that is because it was about Cassie and what they did to Cassie and really just that horrific crime. And I know that Cassie's mom did pass away in 2022, but did her family not want to be involved in this because the Adamciks were, as well as the Drapers? What did conversations surrounding Cassie really look like?
Well, I can take part of that. So I talked to Anna Stoddard, her mom, in a different treatment for this story years ago, and she was sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of the spokesman for the family. She would talk to the media, and when she died, I think, and we reached out to other family members. I don't think any of them felt comfortable talking about it. Conor, I think you spoke or texted with a couple of the family members. I think when Anna died, I think they had sort of said that's enough.
Yeah, yeah, it was pretty much it. We had been in contact with several family members, and I think a couple were close, and then decided that it's too much to go back to, and obviously we wanna honor that, um, but also because a lot of friends, students, former teachers, all of the Pocatello Police Department, former investigators were all on board, and they saw there was a real value to going back to this, particularly now it's 20 years, and getting former students to speak for the first time, particularly the three that were on that list, and the profound impact it had on them. And I don't think they've ever articulated it really how deeply it set in. And even Amber, who was a close friend of Tori's, she had never done an interview before. And she does still to this day. She's like, I feel like I'm stuck in the past, because she was really close to Tori and never saw any warning signs. And then after this happened, then she felt she became a pariah, that she had to retreat into the shadows, because here she was close friends with a convicted murderer.
Really, such deep conversations. I mean, the series really sparked a lot of existential questions that we all talked about. But my last question to you both is, what do you want viewers to take away from the series? Because aside from everything we talked about, something that stuck out to me, one of the girls who was a high school student at the time, she's now a parent herself. She said something in the series like, I always tell my kids, be careful who your friends are, choose your friends wisely. What are the takeaways you want your viewers to have?
Uh, I think one thing that sticks with me is, you've got two seemingly normal teenage boys with within the normal range of interests, horror movies, sports, skateboarding. But there was something going on just below the surface with both of them. And I think, for me, the thing that is very haunting about this is that the parents didn't know, the school didn't know, the kids, nobody knew that this was boiling under the surface. And that's kind of scary to me, is that even these kids' own parents, when these kids went up to their rooms at night and logged on the internet, they had no idea who they were talking to, what they were planning. When somebody comes over and says, hey, I'm going to go out with Brian or Tori, and they get in the car, that's it. They had no idea about what was happening next. And that, to me, is pretty scary, is that teenagers obviously can do something horrible like this with no warning, and the parents have no idea what's coming, and that's a little terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, similar. Being a parent is the toughest job on the planet. I sometimes I'll catch my daughter looking out the window and the rearview mirrors are driving, and I think, what is she thinking about right now? And she's probably thinking about unicorns and rainbows and all these other things, but you don't really know what's going on in that mind. And I think the teenage crisis is something that we're grappling with right now in society, of the aftermath of social media and what that's done to the teenage brain. And Brian and Tori, like Pat said, early YouTube and internet, and this was the first generation that could really dive into some really dark spaces. And it's impossible for anyone to know. And so for me, I think I am thankful. This may sound strange, but to the Drapers and the Adamciks, and even to Brian and Tori, for being so wide open about this, because I think Tori touched on something. I think Brian touched on something. For them as adults to look back as their former self, to explain where they were right now. So maybe it is a cautionary tale for parents, particularly, like, engage, talk, look into, monitor a little bit closer, let them live their life. But at the same time, they need help. This is the adolescent period is so profound on everybody. Everybody remembers that time in their life. And, some people would even say that high school is a nightmare experience. And for this one in particular, it truly was a nightmare experience. If that could be the greatest takeaway, that there's actually some good, that people kind of like open up and start talking to their kids a little bit more. And as hard as it is, I think that's something we can take away from this documentary.
And your series, The Scream Murder, is out now. Where can people find it?
Hulu. Yeah, Disney Plus, Hulu app. Yep.
And thank you both so, so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to dive into your series as well as the making behind the story. You both are welcome back anytime.
Thanks very much for having us.